Our speaker today is Blair. She's a director of curriculum programming at the Turner School of Entrepreneurship and Innovation and a professor of entrepreneurship at Bradley University. She completed her PhD in organizational behavior and entrepreneurship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MBA in entrepreneurial skills at Texas Tech University. She serves on the advisory board for numerous social ventures and government agencies, as well as advising students on business formation and ideation. Eden is a board member of Graffelman Farms Animal Rescue and the Peoria County board member for District 6. We're so happy to have you here. Welcome, Eden.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to see so many cameras on. I normally teach to just a black void of off cameras. Although I did once catch a student like taking a hit on a bong during class. And I'm like, at least turn your camera off for that, right? That's all I'm saying. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. Find what I need. Okay, can you see my slides? All right, let me take a look at this. I was asked to talk about risk. I think this is a really interesting time to talk about risk because we're all living in a very risky situation. So as Michelle said, my name is Eden Blair. I am a professor of entrepreneurship and I study entrepreneurial cognition. So really I study how entrepreneurs make sense of their reality and navigate it. This is the view outside my window as we speak. So I know most of you are in the San Diego area. We've got 7 inches of snow on Thursday, and we just heard we're going to get 6 to 9 inches next Thursday. I grew up in Texas, so despite the fact that I've lived up north for like 20 years, I'm still struggling, not with snow. It's when I'm done with snow, like the end of February. I'm now done with it. Anyway, welcome. Thank you guys for having me. All right, so when we talk about risk, there's actually a couple different things that when we use the word risk that we're really meaning. Not everything is officially risk. So risk is when you have a known probability of outcomes. So for example, we know I'm going to use COVID a lot because we all know it. So I apologize for using COVID maybe too much, but we know there's like a 17 times greater chance of being hospitalized if you are not vaccinated than vaccinated. So that's a known risk. Now you don't know your personal outcome in that risk, whether you're going to get sick or not, going to get hospitalized or not, going to die or not, but you have an understanding of the probability. In a lot of things, we actually live in a world of uncertainty, and this is true for entrepreneurs, but also a lot of us in a lot of situations. If we do not have a understanding of the known outcomes, because we're in a future that doesn't have a historical past, then we actually are in a state of uncertainty where we have no idea how much risk we're going to have and how much we're not. A good example of that is like COVID. We now know quite a bit, but there's still a lot of things we don't know. We don't know how long-term COVID is going to work. We don't know the long-term effects of our vaccines. We don't know the long-term effects of lockdown, right? And those are uncertainty. Between these two, there's a word called ambiguity. And this is what a lot of managers face, a lot of organizations just face in the real world. We have some idea of what the outcomes could be, but we can't put a number exactly to it. So for example, early on in the COVID epidemic, we could use our knowledge of infectious diseases in general and SARS infections to give us some idea of what this would be like, but it wouldn't necessarily be exactly that way. So when we talk about risk, the majority of us don't really live in this world of risk where we have a known amount of risk. We live in some kind of ambiguous or uncertain world. Here's one of the things we've learned. So if I go back to risk, so economists would say that you could use a mathematical formula for risk. And as long as the benefits outweigh the outcome of the risks, you're more likely to take it. And so, but what we find out is that's not necessarily true. So if I was flipping a coin, and let's say that flipping a coin has 50-50 chance of being heads or tails. It's actually a little higher chance of being heads. And there was a $10 chance. If it was heads, I would win $10. If it was tails, I would lose $10. A certain number of people are willing to do that, and a certain number of people aren't. If I made it $100, you would find that, in fact, fewer people are willing to do it than not. And that different people are willing to take that risk over others, even though mathematically they're the same 50% chance of getting it right. But what we find is that, in fact, people do have different risk-taking propensities. So what are the things we've learned? I have a background in neuroeconomics and neuropsychology. And in these fields, we use biological models to try to understand how the brain is working in these situations. So one of the most common ones is using a functional MRI, an fMRI, which allows the brain to show what blood flow is going to what parts of the brain at any one time. And it can be done in real time. So you can ask a question and see what parts of the brain are being used. And that helps us understand both the speed at which we make decisions and what parts of the brains we're making decisions in, which might show us more about our decision-making process. So one of the things they have found out is that when looking at risky situations, our emotions matter far more than I think any of us are willing to bet. We make risky decisions based on emotions, not necessarily on kind of cognitive rational thought. And in fact, what we find is that we're most likely to make those decisions emotionally and unconsciously, which means we don't even know we're feeling it. We just know that our brain is out there feeling. Second, conscious emotion. So we actually perceive the feelings, right? We're scared or excited or happy. Unconscious cognition. So we think about what we're doing unconsciously, and then conscious cognition, where we actually really realize that we're weighing A versus B and making a decision from it. We also know that part of risk is this idea of priming. And I, in fact, did quite a bit of this work when I was at Wisconsin-Madison. Priming basically states that in a certain situation, we're likely to behave based on mental constructs that we have created earlier in your life. So like if I were to call you by your first and middle name, most of us would immediately start panicking and thinking, what did we do wrong? And that's because our parents, when they called us by our first and middle name, we knew we were in trouble, right? So that immediately makes us feel certain things. It makes us start acting certain ways, makes us start thinking certain ways. And this can be the case of risk too, is that if we've had situations that have had negative outcomes, we're more likely in similar situations to not take a risk, even though it might make sense to do so in this situation. This one I think you can really see with COVID. One of the things we have learned is that people are more likely to be willing to take a risk when they trust the person or the data or the situation that they're in. So the most people who are unwilling to take a vaccine, who don't have a good reason, such as they have a medical issue that would make taking the vaccine risky, it comes down to trust. They feel like trust isn't there. They don't trust the government. They don't trust Pfizer. They don't trust doctors. They're not trusting the experts who are telling them things. So what do they end up trusting? They end up trusting that, their friend's cousin got COVID and was okay, right? Or they have a friend who knows a guy who works at the CDC who said that wearing masks is all just done to make us feel better. Right? I hear that one. I have way too many friends who know a guy who works at the CDC to actually be true, but they trust different groups. we have found that trust makes sense even in financial decisions. So trust can be increased by things like increased levels of oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone of love, but it's also the hormone of trust. And you can actually increase oxytocin by shaking someone's hand, giving them a hug. There's even been studies that they've actually taken men in a room, in 2 rooms, where one, they actually sprayed oxytocin into the room and one they didn't. And what they found was that the room where they sprayed oxytocin, they had them then make decisions on what kind of stocks they would buy. The people who had the oxytocin spent more money and bought more stocks than those who didn't. This is not to tell you to spray oxytocin at your family dinner so that everyone will get the vaccine. That's actually quite dangerous to do. But it also, we're in a situation where we don't get to touch people as much as we used to. We don't get to be with people as much, and we may not be generating the trust that we normally have. We also have groups who are teaching us to mistrust experts. And so when you trust no one, you'll believe anything. And we're finding that people are making riskier decisions because they refuse to trust that the people who actually know what they're talking about are saying things truthfully. I actually just brought up this infographic because this has been an interestingly, every week, this is a local hospital system in downstate Illinois, and every week they have been publishing this, and this has been more useful than any other piece of data to try to convince people that, yeah, you should get vaccinated. So the green avatars are people who are fully vaccinated. Pink means that they're not fully vaccinated. And then the blue are unvaccinated. And it's pretty clear pretty quickly that being unvaccinated is more likely to make you both hospitalized in the ICU and on ventilators. And by the way, in my community, we're at about 59% vaccinated. So we see way more than 31% who are unvaccinated, and there 41% that are unvaccinated in there. This somehow has worked, but then there are other people who will see this and go, oh, look at that one green guy who's on a ventilator. That means you shouldn't get a vaccine. That goes down to a confirmation bias, that when you really feel like I shouldn't trust the experts and I shouldn't believe anyone but the people I know, you're likely to find data that confirms your theory. So, oh, look, you can be vaccinated but still end up on a ventilator, then disconfirm. Oh, look at all the people who aren't fully vaccinated who are on the ventilator. So what does this all mean? Well, first of all, I just want to say really quickly, when we look at things like COVID, remember there's no winning. So if I'm looking at something like our heads tails, where I get $10 if I win and $10 I lose $10 if I lose, there's a win. There's no win to COVID, right? There's no winning at COVID. There's having a best worst case scenario. Basically, you are, no matter what you do, you're risking something. So I'm diabetic and asthmatic. So working with college-age students is a risk to me, but also staying home increases my risk of depression and anxiety. So it's all about balancing those risks in a way that makes sense. And that can be very complicated when the data is not really even as to what you should do where. So as we look at risk, let's look at these ideas of affordable loss. So in entrepreneurship, what we find is that entrepreneurs have about the same risk-taking propensity as non-entrepreneurs. They actually aren't more willing to take risks. But what we find out is that they just don't think of risk the way that the average person does. And their method of looking at risk may be useful for those of us who aren't entrepreneurs. Instead, they look at affordable loss, which means what am I willing to lose in order to try something new or in order to do something, right? So am I willing to wear a face mask if it allows me to be out with people, right? What am I willing to lose? I don't want to get super sick, so I'm going to get vaccinated, but I'm willing to be out with people, even if it means I go on quarantine for 2 weeks. And so what we see is that in entrepreneurs, they pick a level of risk that they're willing to do. So this is what they're willing to lose, and then try to push, find ways to control their environment in such a way to increase the returns. Kind of your classic banker look of risk is that they take an acceptable return. So we want to make 12% return on what we're doing. And then they try to find ways to reduce risk. So they're only going to invest in people who with high credit ratings. They might reduce things by insurance, things like that. People that they know, going back to trust is an important part of that. So what can you be willing to lose? So affordable loss theory really looks at 3 different things. One is money. So I might not be willing to lose $80,000, but I might be willing to lose $5,000. Or I might think about a lottery ticket, right? So we know that the chances of an upside gain of winning the lottery is exceptionally low. But I might be willing to lose $2 if I get the joy and excitement of that, 24 hours between me purchasing the ticket and me finding out that I lost all the things I can imagine I'm going to do with the money, how many of my enemies I'm going to smite, how many cool trips I'm going to take, that $2 is worth it to lose for all the excitement and positive emotion I get until I find out that I lost, right? Also, like, let's say that your grandmother leaves you $5,000. So it's a windfall of some kind. Maybe you're willing to lose that. So you get bought out by your company who's trying to downsize. You take that money to start a business or something. Also time. So am I willing to invest a certain amount of time to try something new that I could have spent doing other things? Could I have spent time that required me to work after my job to do stuff? What is it? And then finally, relationships. So am I willing to risk my significant other breaking up with me because I put too much time into this, or I spent all of our money on it? Am I willing to miss my child's soccer tournaments? Or is that something that I'm not willing to lose? Understanding this means that even if you fail, even if you get the downside risk, as long as you really thought this through and said, yeah, I'm willing to lose that, then you didn't lose, you learned a way not to do it. Oops, my little thing's not working. Okay, and so then what we find is that people in this kind of mindset are more likely to mitigate risks. And think about all the things we're doing for COVID, right? So we're wearing masks, we're vaccinating, we're avoiding people as much as we can, whatever it might be. We're finding ways to be together virtually, like with Zoom, that not only protects us from being together and the risks of passing the virus, but gives us a healthy way to connect to each other, because we know being together socially matters from a mental health standpoint. Those are all mitigation efforts that we can do, right? So I drive a car and I might mitigate the risks of driving a car by wearing a seatbelt and driving a newer car that has more safety measures, things like that. So I think I'm at right about the right time. So does risk matter is one of my conclusion things. One thing to think about is that risk is always seen in hindsight. So if I, let's say that there was less than 1%. So let's say 0.1% chance that I could get a cancer by presenting on Zoom. That's a made up number. Don't quote me on that. Let's say that. Well, that seems like it's a reasonable risk to take. Well, if I don't get cancer, it was a reasonable risk to take. But if I got cancer, it's 100% sucks, right? it wasn't a reasonable risk to take. So trying to look at risks almost always happens in hindsight, and it was worth it if you won and not worth it if you didn't, means that maybe we shouldn't look at risks so much as why people do things differently. Can we understand our emotions better? Can we understand what's going on? So people who tend to be fearful take less risk. That makes sense. But interestingly, people who are angry, who tend to show anger, are actually more optimistic about their chances of success, and they actually take more risks than others who are not angry or who are fearful. What can we do to build trust? Think about times like this. So can we have more moments of connection? Can we tell people things about our background that helps us trust them more? What can we do to build that trust so that when we come to a risky situation, they may be willing to listen to us when maybe they didn't before? And what can we do to control our environment to help mitigate these risks? What can we manage to do to not necessarily be unwilling to take a risk, but try to find ways to make risk less risky? I guess is the best way to do it. I did include here additional readings that has some more on this, including a chapter I wrote in the book Neuroeconomics in the Firm, which also has chapters on risk and trust, which are definitely worth checking out if this is something that interests you. That is all I have in my time now. I hope that was useful, and I'm going to stick around for a breakout session for anyone who wants to be in a breakout room for that. So.
Eden.